Now, this part is about management of FIV and FeLV in shelter situations, and it is focusing on rescue shelters. And what I'm talking about is based on recommendations of expert groups, such as the Advisory Board on Cat Diseases that Katrin already mentioned. And as you can see, the last update was just a few months ago, which is, I think, is very nice for our timing today. And then we also consider recommendations of the American Association of Feline Practitioners and recommendations of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians. So all these guidelines are free available, and when you download and read, you'll see that all of these expert groups share very high priorities, and all of them advise against euthanizing cats just because of retrovirus infection. And I guess you do so too. And this priority made me think about, what do we know about euthanizing rates in shelters in general? And well, what we know from shelter surveys that have been performed in the United States is that rates have decreased over time, but cats are still twice as likely to be euthanized in shelters compared to dogs. And this is despite higher dog intakes. And one very recent study, also from the United States, specifically focused on the current status of retrovirus management in shelters in Florida, which is a region with chronic pet overpopulation and high shelter admissions. And in some 139 shelters participated, most shelters, so 83%, stated that they are screening at least some cats for retrovirus infection, but only half of these shelters screens all incoming cats for FIV and FeLV. And on this map here, you can see all the shelters with screening programs, and you can see how many of them offer adoption programs for FeLV positive cats marked in orange, and for FIV positive cats marked in green. And which is quite nice, I think. But interestingly, 50% of these shelters with adoption programs would place the cat regardless of other cats in the new homes, which is some kind of scary. The most common alternative for retrovirus positive cats instead of adoption was making retrovirus positive cats available for transfer to other organizations like rescue partners or sanctuaries. But quite high percentage of shelters also stated that euthanizing is still routine practice, especially of FeLV positive cats. So 43% of the shelters euthanizes FeLV positive, and 25% of the shelters euthanize FIV positive cats. So far, regarding the current status of retrovirus management, at least in US shelters. Now let's get familiar with what the expert groups say on how to manage and help FeLV and FIV infected cats in shelters. And here's what we're talking about today. We have three major topics. First, why should we care about retrovirus infections, and what is the standard of care in general in shelters? The second topic focuses on the best testing strategies. Finally, we are looking on what happens after testing, especially with the retrovirus positive cats. And I guess after Katrin's talk, you all feel good about your current feline retrovirus knowledge, right? We learned FIV and FeLV are distinct, cause distinct illnesses, but they do have some things in common due to their retrovirus character. So when we go through this part now, this shelter part, we talk about FIV and FeLV together when it's appropriate, and we'll distinguish between FIV and FeLV when we need to. And the first question we are talking about is why do we need to care about retrovirus infections? We are looking at approximately 3 to 4% of shelter cats that test positive for either FeLV antigen or FIV antibodies. This is also according to a big US study that was performed in 2017, and we found quite the same for our shelters in Germany and Bavaria. Results have not been published yet, but prevalence in our shelters was quite the same, between 2 and 3%. And to make it short, we talk about a prevalence of under 5%. So nothing, but not incredibly common. But when we break it down, of course, you see differences between different countries, as Katrin mentioned, higher prevalence in southern European countries, and higher prevalence in cats that have or have had a high infection risk, such as it is often the case when shelters have high intake of stray cats. So retrovirus infections in shelter cats in southern parts of Europe, like yours, are likely still one of the most common and serious feline infections. But the good news, we learned from Katrin, retrovirus infections do not necessarily affect the cat's health when we properly care, when we maintain good health management, which is more true for FIV, but also some kind for FeLV. And the third, certainly the most grateful reason for shelter-wide care is that spread is actually easily preventable. Thanks to the short survival period of the retrovirus outside the host. This is a table also from the ABCD. And I like it because it shows that among all important feline viruses, FIV and FeLV are barely infectious outside the house. So they survive only for minutes in the environment. So if spread is easily preventable, if good health management makes living with high life quality possible, then why should we not care in regions with low, but also especially in regions with a high prevalence? Brings us to the next question. What can we do? What is the standard of care? What should we have in a shelter to be well prepared regarding retrovirus infections? For sure, shelters need to have at least 3 important areas. Quarantine area for incoming cats, then let's call it normal accommodations for healthy non-infected cats, and places for isolation for infected or also otherwise sick cats. So these 3 areas, this is a must-have for a shelter. The quarantine area is, as mentioned, for all incoming cats. And the first procedures that need to be done in this compartment is checking if the cat has a chip. If it does, you would try to find the owner sub. If the cat doesn't have a chip, it gets chipped. Of course, it gets a physical examination. It gets tested for FIV and FeLV, coming back to this later on. It gets vaccinated, and it gets treated with antiparasitics. The duration of the quarantine stay depends on the shelter's conditions, meaning the quarantine housing conditions, the available capacities. And of course, it depends on the risk for certain infections that are commonly observed in the respective local shelter. If cats are kept in quarantine conditions that are less than ideal, they should stay there for a minimum duration of 2 or better 3 weeks. This time is necessary to protect against risk of cats incubating acute respiratory infections or feline panleukopenia. Or incubation time, incubation time of acute Gallizien herpes virus infection is usually no longer than 1 week. That one of panleukopenia is actually no longer than 2 weeks. And if the shelter considers to also protect against risk of reactivation of latent herpes virus infections, then the duration of quarantine should be extended to 3 weeks. But in terms of FIV and FeLV, quarantine should actually not be shorter than 6 weeks, especially in regions with high prevalence, because this is the time that is necessary to reliably detect cats with recently acquired infections. Reliable tests for FIV and FeLV, and this is according also again to all expert groups, a reliable test is standard of care for intake of cats in a shelter. It is considered 100% essential and unavoidable for shelters that allow contact between cats after time of quarantine. This means if a cat is initially tested negative at time of income, it should be retested after 6-week quarantine before it gets together with other cats, right? This is really important because testing and separating prevents the spread of retrovirus infections, and it's a really effective way that we do not have for any other infections, not for Gallizien, not for herpes, corona, or parvovirus. FIV, yeah, Katrin also already mentioned, FIV is mainly transmitted by biting, besides some other theoretical modes of transmission. But for practical purposes, it is mostly transmitted by biting. So a risk of transmission is given when new cats enter groups that become unstable. And it can be very high when we mix cats without screening tests, also true for FLV. But the risk for indirect transmission is close to zero. FELV can be transmitted by biting as FIV, but it can also be transmitted by friendly social interactions since it is shed in large amounts, especially in saliva. And so it can be easily transmitted by contact with other cats. So for FLV, you've got a broader range of possible routes of transmission that you have to be aware of. You don't need to have unstable groups. It's enough to mix cats without prior screening. So it is even more true for FLV. Testing and separating cats is most effective, even more than the available vaccination against FLV. But with testing and segregation, you go for the most effective way to prevent spread, and this is why it is really important for the shelters. So comes to the next question: how do we test? What is the best testing strategy? In shelters where contact between cats cannot be prevented, all incoming cats should be tested for FIV antibodies and FLV antigen at income and retested before mixing. The AFP and the ASV consider testing as optional when cats can be individually housed. So if individual housing is an option in a shelter, you can test not all, but only high-risk cats, namely sick cats, cats with bite wounds, those from high-risk situations, stray cats. But then testing is essential at latest before the cat enters a group of cats or a new home. So you see, finally, it needs to be tested anyway. Now we have to distinguish between FELV and FIV. It is important, Katrin also mentioned, to know that we are not testing for the same thing. For FELV, we are testing for antibodies. We are testing the immune response to FIV infection, whereas for FELV, we are testing for viral antigen, and this is important for the test result interpretation. What we usually do is we do physical examination, take blood, perform the test, which is typical, a point of care test right next to us. It brings the result directly within minutes. That's the most practical way. But we have to have one thing in mind. POC tests can deliver false positive and false negative results. So there are differences in the sensitivity and the specificity. This can happen for both FIV antibodies and FELV antigen. So we need to weigh up whether we should verify a positive test result or a negative test result. And actually, we would verify the test result with a second point of care test. Here is a table of several studies that compare different point of care tests for the detection of FELV antigen, considering sensitivity and specificity. And for those who want to take the time to have a look, I put it in. I just want to mention one thing. Besides sensitivity and specificity, you can see in the brackets below the predictive values, the negative predictive values, NPVs, and positive predictive values, PPVs. And the predictive values give information on how reliable is a negative or a positive test result. And this depends on the prevalence. The higher the prevalence, the more reliable is a positive test result and less reliable a negative. And the way around, the lower the prevalence in a country, the more reliable is a negative and the less reliable is a positive test result. You understand? So the prevalence is the basis for the calculation of the predictive values. We are coming to the next point. What we immediately do when we see a positive result in Germany, where we have a low prevalence, we want to verify a positive test by retesting with a second test. It's in general a second point of care test from another manufacturer. When should we verify a positive test result? I mean, you have when should you verify a positive test result? I mean, for sure you have a higher prevalence. You should think about retesting a low-risk cat, or whenever a positive test result would lead to euthanization. The way around, you should retest a negative cat when it is considered to be a high-risk cat. You understand? Now, we talk a bit more about interpretation of reliable test results that, when in doubt before, have already been confirmed with a second test. So now we talk about results we consider to be really positive or really negative. When do we have to retest? This is what Katrin also mentioned. Cats that are FIV antigen negative and or FIV antibody negative at time of income should be retested 6 weeks later. This time is necessary to reduce the risk of missing a very recent infection, since it may take up to 6 weeks or even longer for FIV antibodies to become detectable and 4 to 6 weeks for FIV antigen to become detectable. So very important in high-risk areas. A negative test in high-risk areas at income does never exclude recent infection. We have to wait and retest again. Genau. And now again, we have to talk about FIV and FELV separately. If we detect FIV antibodies in an adult cat from Europe, reliable test result antibodies are present. This means that the cat is either infected with FIV, or if it is a young cat, it can be antibodies, maternal antibodies. That does not necessarily mean infection. If you're testing a kitten less than 6 months of age, a positive test result can occur due to the maternal antibodies. Remember, we're not testing the actual virus, we're testing for the immune response. And kittens from an FIV infected queen, they get antibodies from their mom as part of the normal protective process for kittens, and those antibodies take a while, up to 6 months, to leave that kitten system, which is good because that's helpful to protect the kitten from infection. And in most cases, FIV is not less likely to be less likely to be transmitted from a mother to the kitten. So if you have a kitten that tests positive for FIV, it may be just mom's antibodies and not infection. However, antibody-positive kittens need to stay in quarantine until retesting at age of 6 months. Or you could theoretically try to confirm FIV infection of the kitten with a positive FIV PCR, but you cannot rule it out with a negative PCR. So I think that's not practical. If we detect FIV antigen, it's a bit more complicated, as Katrin already mentioned. FIV antigen indicates that a cat is FIV infected and is shedding virus. A positive FIV antigen test may result from either the progressive infection that goes along with usually lifelong viremia, or regressive infection with only initial viremia in the early stage that later on disappears. So if we detect FIV antigen, we have to retest in any way in order to differentiate between progressive and regressive infection. You can differentiate between these infections when you retest antigen 6 weeks later, and if the cat is becoming negative, it is very likely a regressive infection. Could theoretically be confirmed by provirus PCR, because provirus stays in the cat, it is just inactivated. If the cat, however, still tests antigen positive over a longer time, repeatedly 6 weeks later, which I know is a challenge for shelters, it is very likely progressive infection. Cats with progressive infection should not be mixed with non-infected cats, but also cats with progressive infection should not be mixed with non-infected cats due to risk of reactivation of progressive infection. Yeah, this is theoretically possible. Differentiation is important because it makes a difference for the long-term management, whether a cat is progressively or regressively infected. Cats with regressive infection are in the later stage when they overcome viremia, considered to be protected. So they do not shed FIV, but remain pro-virus positive with, as said, some risk of reactivation. If cats with a positive FIV antigen, I summarized this, if cats with a positive FIV antigen test cannot be quarantined individual until retesting, these animals have to be considered infected and considered as shedders. So, yes. Now it's the question, how do we care after testing? We are coming back to the quarantine. We have a healthy cat that tested negative for retrovirus infections once at the beginning of quarantine. Then it was vaccinated against core components like feline virus, herpes, and calicivirus. It was dewormed and treated against ectoparasited and tested negative for retrovirus infection now at the end of quarantine for the second time, 6 weeks later. No high-risk history, so we believe in the negative results. And of course, in this case, the cat can be housed in normal accommodations in groups with other retrovirus negative cats. These are pictures from a shelter from Bavaria as an example for really good housing conditions where small groups of cats are kept together in a room with an extra fenced outdoor area. The way around, if a cat is indeed FIV or FIV positive, it cannot be grouped, housed with non-infected cats. It must be isolated. Procedures in quarantine are quite the same as for non-infected cats. For sure, the positive cat needs very thorough physical examination in order not to miss secondary infections. So you have to check the weight, the temperature, the whole skin, the eyes, the ears, nose, teeth, every body opening. You remember the picture of Candida and Chlamydia infection from Katrin. And if the cat is healthy, meaning in the asymptomatic course of infection, asymptomatic course of retrovirus infection, it of course also needs to be vaccinated and treated against parasites. How effective are vaccinations in asymptomatic retrovirus infected cats? How safe are vaccinations? There have been some studies performed, and overall it can be assumed that retrovirus infected cats are able to respond to vaccination in a similar and in a safe way as healthy cats do, at least when they are in the asymptomatic stage of infection. So these cats, retrovirus positive healthy cats, can get vaccinated against the core components. On the other way, if the cat indeed suffers from acute illness, we have to weigh up. You should never vaccinate ill animals, but you can overcome the time of the acute illness, like secondary infections that you, of course, would treat aggressively. You can overcome this time by passive immunization, by giving antibodies. These are commercially available as efilizerine, and vaccinate later on after 2 to 3 weeks with modified live virus. After quarantine, the cat needs to be isolated, and the isolation facility for retrovirus positive cats needs to be far away from the quarantine. Why? We are less afraid of FIV, FeLV transmission to other cats. We are afraid of what can happen to the retrovirus cats that are immunocompromised and predisposed for secondary infections. And we know that shelters have conditions that are less than perfect. Shelters are often surrounded by lots of pathogens. And actually, the very most important for retrovirus infected cats is getting adopted out from shelter as soon as possible. This is important to reduce stress for the cat, to reduce risk for secondary infections, and of course, adoption also relieves the shelter's resources. So cats should really be given to new owners that can guarantee indoor household only, again, because of the risk of secondary infections outside. And they should be given to new owners that can manage a single cat household. Of course, FIV-infected cats can be housed together with other FIV-infected cats. The same is true for FELV-infected cats, but these two retrovirus-infected cats should not be mixed. That's important. Prospective owners should be informed about the existing infections and the possible consequences, their responsibilities to avoid virus spread to other cats. So keeping the cat strictly on indoors in a single cat household or with other the same infected cats. They need to be informed about potential upcoming illness and the need for regular veterinary health checks that are necessary, actually every 6 months, in which the veterinarian considers to also perform laboratory checks like CBC, a serum profile, urine and fecal examinations. More frequent vaccinations may be necessary in FELV-infected cats. There's one study on rabies antibodies that found that FELV-infected cats are more likely to lack antibodies. So you should consider more frequent vaccinations in FELV-infected cats, and you can determine the necessity of vaccinations, at least vaccinations against feline panleukopenia, when you're measuring antibodies in blood. If the cat has antibodies, it is protected against feline panleukopenia, and if it does not have antibodies, it needs to be vaccinated or should be re-vaccinated. Now, I think one of the most important questions is, how can we find new owners? What can we do? For sure, you will have a homepage where you introduce your cats to interested adopters. Maybe you can connect yourself with rescue organizations or groups on Facebook to spread information on your cats as far as possible. There are people and owners that have a passion specifically for retrovirus-infected cats. And I met 2 of these guys, really wonderful guys, and they were willing to give some kind of a testimonial. They prepared now for this presentation. They prepared a short video, which I'm really happy to show to you, and we'll start it now. I hope it works. Yes. So I'm not sure if you have these opportunities too in your regions, but I think, yeah, if not, it's time to start these options to go ahead. And this is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions and have some discussions with Katrin